Tanks form the shock force of modern armies, the iron fist with which 20th century generals batter down an enemy. 100 years ago, it was the cavalry, mounted swordsmen or lancers, who rushed across the battlefield to deliver the decisive blow. On today's battlefields, like here in Israel on the Golan Heights, modern cavalrymen ride to the charge on tracks, behind cannon and armor. Here on this Merkava, the Hebrew word for chariot, you can clearly see the three principles that have been fundamental to the concept of the tank from the beginning: protection, firepower, and mobility. For protection, there's the armor plating, a foot or more thick here at the front end. Uniquely, this tank has its engine also in the nose as added protection for its crew. For firepower, there's the 105mm gun, a weapon that can knock out another tank 2 miles away. There are also 3 heavy machine guns up there on top. Mobility is provided by the 900 horsepower engine underneath here. It means that this 60-ton monster can travel 20 miles an hour across open country, it can climb a 30-degree gradient, and it can cross 9-foot ditches. These then are the 3 principles of every tank, and throughout its short history, its success has depended on getting the right balance between them. It was on battlefields 2,000 miles distant from the Golan and 80 years away in time that the idea of the tank was introduced to the military imagination. The First World War crisscrossed the landscape with barbed wire, trenches, and crater fields. Cavalry, which had won quick victories for 2,000 years, was blown from the battlefield in the first few weeks. The Industrial Revolution had made the cavalryman and his horse obsolete, but it had invented new forms of horsepower that unconventional minds realized could be made to take their place. The Caterpillar tractor, seen here in a film of 1908 advertising its usefulness to the farmer, was one of them. Machines like these took hold of the imagination of soldiers like Ernest Swinton. Appalled by his first sight of the Western Front, his mind turned to the tractor as a way through it. On Christmas Day, 1914, he wrote a requirement for a bulletproof vehicle which would roll down barbed wire by sheer weight and support the advance by machine gun fire. It would become the specification for the first tank. This is one of the earliest tanks. It's called the Mark IV and came into service in 1917. Already the 3 principles are beginning to show up, albeit in rudimentary form. Mobility. On these tracks, it could roll at 3.5 miles an hour. For firepower, Hotchkiss machine guns, and further forward, the 6-pounder. But it was in protection that the British Army was mainly interested. And although its armor was only half an inch thick, it was enough to protect the crew from enemy fire. Fear naught was the motto adopted by the British Tank Corps from the earliest days, in tribute to the tank's bullet-stopping skin. The tank was a revolutionary weapon. To man it on the battlefield demanded a special breed of soldier. One of the pioneers, George Brown, recalls the early days.
There was a crew of 8 in the tank. There was the driver on the primary gears. The officer sat on his left on the handbrakes. I was a Lewis gunner. There were 2 Lewis gunners in each sponson, 2 sponsons on each side of the tank. So it took 4 men to drive the tank. And the other 4 men were just gunners.
Mag switch. Check gun.
You were trained to do all the jobs. You were trained on the secondary gears, you were trained on the machine guns, you were trained on the 6-pounder guns, and of course you were trained as a driver.
Good. Gun free and lock. Check gear stick. Neutral. Check clutch. Stand by to start.
The story of the tank can be told by looking at how it has mastered each of its three principles. Protection first, because it was protection the British Army valued highest. Protection for the tank crews, and protection for the infantry following the paths that the tank crushed in the barbed wire. Tank was the cover name adopted while the machines were being built for the Great British Offensive on the Somme in 1916. On the first day, none were ready. The British advanced unprotected against the German machine guns, and 20,000 British soldiers died. 2 months later, with a handful of tanks, the British won the little battle of Flers at far less cost in lives.
Once we started to open fire on the Germans, all hell was let loose. High explosive bursting overhead, shells hitting the ground and bursting. When you first opened fire, there was already the rattle of their machine gun bullets and rifle bullets hitting the side of the tank. And unless they were armour-piercing bullets, they didn't penetrate the tank. They just made a dent, that's all.
You heard a rattle on the outside. It was like something hitting a tin can. The machine gun bullets didn't penetrate, but they threw off shale on the inside of the tank. And it used to pit the face with tiny bits of steel, you see, and they used to bleed. You came out looking a bit sorry. They're so well protected. If you had a direct hit, then you can't say anything about it. You've got to suffer that. For machine gun fire and that sort of thing, it didn't offer any fear at all. No, your object was to get there and back. You didn't see any fear.
Protection came to obsess the minds of some tank designers. Weight defeats mobility in tank design. That's one of the iron rules. Unless, that is, the size of the gun and ammunition load is reduced. The British Matilda, at the start of World War II, had almost impenetrable armour, but its gun, as a consequence, was practically a toy. The American Sherman avoided this defect. It had a good gun and great mobility. It was indeed almost a perfect design, except for poor protection, as some Sherman crewmen recalled.
When we first got them, we thought they were a smashing tank. We did take quite a while in readjusting all the inside pieces to suit our individual tastes. No tank is ever made that suits the whole crew. So you take some pieces out and sew them away, and you put in other pieces, and you alter things around just to suit yourself. Perhaps the metal was a bit thin. We had extra plates welded on the side, right across the ammunition ports. Of course, if you were slightly sideways to the enemy, had a beautiful aiming mark.
It was all hedgerows. We had to go climb over the hedgerows. And every time we show our belly, the Germans would fire 30 millimeters into our belly and blow us up, because that was a very vulnerable spot. The tank around us, our part was all steel, but the belly wasn't that thick. So what they did, the engineers designed a prong, and they welded this onto the front of the tank. So instead of going over the hedgerow, we went through the hedgerow.
But it was the Russians who first hit upon the perfect compromise between a tank's mobility, firepower, and protection. The result was called the T-34. Its qualities astounded German tankmen like Henry Mettelman.
We found the T-34 a very effective weapon. We were frightened of it. When we met it at the first time, they just drove through our lines, and we had little chance to shoot them because they have this shape in front, while ours are more straight. You could hit ours better than theirs. When you hit them, the thing went off or down below.
German crews manning their early tanks thought the design was good.
They seemed to me something like iron horses. I was proud to belong to Panzer troops. We got the Panzer III and we got the Panzer IV. I saw them driving around. It's a powerful thing to watch. And I thought, yes, to be a member of such an army, that's something to be proud of. So I was looking forward to training.
The Panther, and later the Tiger, were the Germans' answer to their experience of meeting the T-34. They had called for bigger guns and stronger armor, and got them in these powerful machines. But however thick the armor, tank men know they are vulnerable to the right shot.
I drove several tanks and also worked with the infantry and the supporting units, tank supporting units. I personally was always happier when I was in a trench, or that wasn't a nice experience either, but in a trench you could put your head down and you could keep out of the way. In a tank you were just sitting there and you were relying totally on your luck that you should not be hit.
I think when you looked at the poor bloody infantry outside, you felt at times sort of very affectionate towards your tank, this wonderful steel womb within which you travelled. On the other hand, although that protected you against shell and mortar fire so long as you were inside it, you were, when you moved across open ground, a very large target for the very accurate and effective German guns, and if you had any sort of imagination, you were aware of what would happen when they got you in their sights.
Tanks, of course, have never been able to offer their crews complete protection. Indeed, part of the story of the tank has been the deadly competition of technological development. As soon as one designer comes up with improved armor, others set about trying to find ways to penetrate it. And this is what happens when protection fails. This Israeli tank dump gives us a glimpse of what happens when a shot strikes home, but not the unforgettable sight of a tank catching fire.
For the moment, you see a cloud of smoke goes around it, and then there's nothing, and then all of a sudden, from where the hole is, smoke starts to come, and then the smoke gradually increases. It's just like lighting a bonfire in the garden. Up it goes, the ammunition catches, the petrol catches, and then it's a ball of fire. And when that goes, that's quite a frightening sight.
We got hit with an 88, right in the middle. The two in the front got killed. The tank commander got out. I got out, and I was burnt. I lost a part of my ear, and I was burnt on my arm. Anyway, I rolled off the back of the tank. But the radio operator had to come out after I got out, had to go underneath the gun and come out. He never made it. He was afire already, because the whole tank blew up. We had just reloaded with a full tank of ammunition, 75 millimeter shells plus machine gun bullets. And as he came out, he was aflame. They did him a favor. They sprayed him and they killed him. They finished him.
If a tank had brewed up and any member of the crew was in the tank and they were burnt, that smell of burning is once again a smell that stays with you. Even nowadays, I hate the smell of burning flesh. If the oven gets a bit hot at home and the meat gets cooked a bit too much, I don't like it. It's a horrible smell.
Anti-tank guns grew deadlier as the war went on. The German 88 was the most effective, made all the more lethal because Germans perfected the trick of drawing enemy tanks into its killing zone. The greatest of the tank killing zones of the Second World War was to be laid by the Russians for the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. The Germans codenamed it Operation Citadel and intended it to be the most decisive tank attack so far. They started the assault with 2,700 tanks. The Russians, who had long been expecting the attack, had prepared one of the strongest defensive positions in the history of warfare. 6,000 anti-tank guns and millions of mines. The German fighting machine was ground down by the weight of fire. Then, on the 6th day of the battle, the Russians went over to the offensive themselves, with nearly 4,000 of their own tanks. 1,000 German tanks were destroyed. The carnage at Kursk revealed all too clearly how vulnerable tanks were when they were launched at strong anti-tank defenses. The tactical strike aircraft now became the tank's deadliest enemy. Against the newly developed air-to-ground missile, the tank's armor cracked like snail shells under a bird's beak. Soon, the tank had to fear infantrymen, too, who had acquired a miniaturized anti-tank weapon. A brave soldier could now kill a tank single-handed. The threat of the missile has had its effect on post-war tanks. Now their armor is sloped at steeper angles to deflect attack, gapped to absorb chemical energy, layered to shatter solid shot. But missiles can still do terrible damage, as Israeli Tank Commander General Yossi testifies.
My tank was hit by a Sagar missile, wire-guided missile, on 12 October on Tel Shams in the Golan.
This British swing fire is the equivalent of the Saga.
We fight with open hatch, and I was with half of my body outside, operating the machine gun. When the missile arrived, I was entangled in the wires. It was a wire-guided missile. And then the second one came. It comes very slowly, like a ball of fire, rolling into your face, explosion in the turret, and then the next thing, a very high heat wave that takes you, and then I felt that I was flying, and the next thing I found myself on the ground, fairly smashed. This explosion, unlike a shell, is not an impact. A shell, and I've been in situations when shells hit my tank, is an impact, fragmentation. The fragmentation that happens, you don't feel. What you feel is this enormous wave of heat around you, and this pressure that just blow you out. And if you're lucky, you stay alive to tell the story.
These ruined tanks from 3 Arab-Israeli wars show all too clearly what happens when protection fails. And they are the grim proof of the second principle in every tank's design: firepower. Experience has proved that there is no such thing as total protection. To survive, a tank crew must control the means to destroy its attackers. It must have mighty firepower. Commander, gunner, loader, driver. The first 3 are involved in firing the gun.
When you fire this 105mm gun, the whole turret is filled with explosion, and then a blast of this gunpowder that remain in the gun and it all come back to the turret. And after the third shot or the fourth shot, the crew inside hardly breathes, and the gunner has to manage to make corrections of half of a mil within this kind of noise. And it's very, very tough on the individual.
British heavy tanks of World War I were of two types. One was armed only with machine guns in its role of supporting infantry. The other, designed to destroy strong points, had machine guns and a 6-pounder naval gun. The A7V, Germany's first tank, had 6 machine guns manned by infantrymen and a cannon served by artillerymen. The engines were supervised by sappers. So there was a total crew of 18. With so many men to accommodate, the A7V was a large and clumsy vehicle. Small wonder it did so badly in the first tank-to-tank engagement in history on April the 24th, 1918. Maneuvering to avoid British fire, it overturned and was abandoned by its crew. Appropriately, its opponent was No. 1 tank of No. 1 section, A Company, 1st Battalion, British Tank Corps. Tank versus tank fights, rare in the First World War, became commonplace in the Second. The caliber of the tank's main armament climbed steadily throughout the war, with the Allies lagging behind the Germans.
The British tanks were, throughout the war, undergunned in comparison with the German tanks. To deal with an enemy Tiger tank, it was necessary to come within something like 200 to 300 yards and place armor-piercing shot either through the turret ring of the German tank or through the periscopes.
Against infantry, the tank's firepower was always devastating, especially if it was equipped with a flamethrower, like the Churchill Crocodile.
There was one particular place where we were actually more or less pinned down by even snipers. Every time a tank commander put his head up, he was fired on. And there was quite a number got head injuries there. And we sent for help. And help came in the form of a flamethrower. One spurt straight up and down the tree, and there was 8 bodies strapped up in the tree, now hanging down loose. We then continued on our journey.
Andrew Wilson commanded such a tank.
We started firing inevitably earlier than we should have done, but we continued flaming right up to the target, and there was a horrible sound, I remember, which I thought could have been the squeaking of the tracks, but in fact were, I believe, the screaming of men. We did, in fact, burn people on that occasion. The sight of the body that the flamethrower had incinerated was particularly horrible.
Since the Second World War, the tank's main gun has become even more powerful. Range finding is far more accurate, and stabilization systems make it possible to fire on the move.
The gun, which is a major weapon system, the 2 machine guns, in our case the 3 machine guns, the mortar that we put, the immediate smoke, the hand grenades, the personal weapon systems that you hold, all this give you, with your 3 other crew members, a firepower equivalent to a full infantry company. You can really aim this fire, and that's the main role of the tank, to move around the battlefield and to bring this firepower under the possession of 4 people, directed to one target and win the battle.
was the aim with which the tank visionaries began. They saw a battlefield on which movement was all but impossible. An armored machine seemed to promise the means of restoring mobility to the soldier. But could those pioneers have even glimpsed the astonishing speed and agility that their brainchild would attain?
Well, the third principle that underlies the concept of the tank, and is the principle that's done more than anything else to change the face of battle in the 20th century, is its mobility. I'm standing in the turret of Challenger, Britain's latest main battle tank, and we just came down a section of that track behind us at over 45 miles an hour. Despite its 62 tons of all-up weight, the Challenger will also go over the roughest terrain very fast indeed, either forwards or, if necessary, backwards. It's tanks like these and their predecessors that have given back to commanders that element of shock that they lost when cavalry disappeared from the battlefield.
The tank reintroduced movement into modern warfare after the stalemate of the First World War, even if the speeds of the early tanks pale into insignificance compared to the modern tank. On no battlefield of the First World War did the tank really make good its potential as an instrument of mobility. At first, it was used in numbers too small to count. Then it was misused, launched in the spring of 1917 into a battlefield that had been shelled into a bomb. At Cambrai in the autumn of 1917, when tanks were used en masse for the first time, cooperation with the infantry broke down. The attack, brilliantly successful at the outset, finally failed. At Amiens in 1918, the greatest of the tank battles of the war, it was the tanks themselves which failed to live up to their promise. They proved too slow and too unreliable. They undoubtedly terrified the Germans, but they did not demonstrate that they were a decisive instrument of breakthrough. With the victory of the Allies, the traditional High Command thought that trench warfare would not happen again, so the importance of the tank was downgraded. The Americans even abolished the tank corps after 1918. In France, the infantry and artillery fought for control of the tanks, and the infantry won. This meant tanks became the infantry's handmaiden. In the British Army, the tank corps, though well established by 1926, was resented, especially by the cavalry. The conservative military leaders of the day saw the tank's job as supporting the other arms in the various roles once carried out, as the battle developed, by the cavalry.
You had a sort of period of skirmishing as you approached the enemy, in which you had light forces, which in the very old days had been cavalry, who told you where the enemy were while you made up your mind whether or not you were actually going to accept battle and how you were going to accept it. And then you had a major battle in which the infantry took a classic part. And they saw tanks as being required for two things: to act as sort of light cavalry, in which case you wanted light tanks, and to act in support of the infantry in the main battle itself, and also to act, as cavalry was used in the Middle Ages and beyond, as a sort of shock action at a crucial part in the battle which had been created by the infantry fighting.
Yet it was two British military thinkers, Basil Liddell Hart and General Fuller, who proposed the idea of the tank revolution. They argued that the tank was the key to the military future, and that far from being anyone's handmaiden, the tank was destined to be the queen of battle, around which all other arms would be organized. Their views aroused as much official enthusiasm as the arrival of a horse butcher at a cavalry barracks. In Germany, where defeat had shattered the power of vested interests, Liddell, Hart and Fuller found a hearing. Germany had been forbidden tanks by the Versailles Treaty, but the army had experimented with them in secret. By 1933, they had a few prototypes. When they were demonstrated to Adolf Hitler, he exclaimed with delight, "That's what I need." That's what I want. He lavished money on the German Panzer arm so that by 1939 it could field 10 tank divisions. They were organized to attack, as Fuller and Little Hart had taught, in a compact mass, supported overhead by clouds of tactical aircraft. Their aim was to create irresistible shock on a very narrow front and break in. Once break-in had been achieved, breakthrough was to be completed by finding and exploiting the weak spots inside the enemy positions. It would spread panic and cause psychological as much as material damage. Blitzkrieg, the Germans called the new concept, lightning war. Blitzkrieg struck down Poland first, and then Holland, Belgium, and France. But it was in Russia that Blitzkrieg achieved its most spectacular effects. The world will hold its breath, boasted Hitler at the outset of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. 3 army groups, each tipped by the cutting edge of a panzer corps, broke through the Red Army. 300, 600, 900,000 Russian soldiers and their equipment were swallowed up at a single gulp. Blitzkrieg had changed the face of warfare.
I remember when we took Rostov, for instance, with the tanks, and I was one of the first tanks who drove into Rostov when we took the city away from the Russians. To have conquered a town, to go into the town square, and then there were all the burned out trams were lying around, and you got out of your tank, you were black from all the oil and dust and things flowing around. You had taken a town, you have beaten the enemy, you are the master of it. Okay, a few of them got killed, of your own mates or so. You went over to the other crews and you were laughing again, and then one quickly forgot all the horror things.
In the western desert of North Africa, the Germans also waged a war of movement against the British, though not one they had all their own way. The British were acquiring better tanks and becoming expert in using them. In Europe, the Americans too quickly grasped the secrets of tank warfare. When the Allies descended on Normandy in 1944 to begin the liberation of France, they proved to the Germans that they too had mastered the tactics of breakthrough. Overwhelming air power was part of the secret, widespread use of radio the other.
The magic ingredient for even the tanks themselves to be controlled was the development of being able to use radio sets down to every individual tank on the move.
Pulled back, and they looked as if they...
Here on the plains of Germany, British tank crews in their chieftains developed the difficult art of communicating by radio.
Charlie, this is a warning order. Alpha, 3 tanks, grid, 612 783. Mission to destroy. Wait, Charlie, right flanking. The Delta. Call sign 10, 30, and 40. To move around Firebase. Call sign 10, current location. Call sign 20 with this call sign will mask and prevent enemy movement.
The other 10 tanks in your company, them you have to control through radio. It's very difficult. You have to convey to them through some metallic voice all the emotions, all the energy that you want them to carry in the situation where they face the enemy, and you want them to be placed in the right position, because sometimes 2 meters makes a difference.
2712, good 612, 783. Next fire position is just to the left of the barn on the barn. 0, this is Oscar 10. I've now moved out into position. We're able to see this contact.
The problem, of course, as with any military command, is to know what's going on and to be able to see as far as possible. Very seldom possible to see where everybody was. You are the whole time concentrating on what is going on the radio, as well as using your own eyes and your own feel about all the noises going on. And of course, you are on the radio forwards as well as backwards.
Oscar 20, this is Sarah, reference your contact. An 11 probe, 612-283, confirm one tank, application over. Oscar 20, at the moment. Oscar 21 is moving round, over. Sarah, roger, out.
As the Second World War drew to its climax, the tank began to fall victim to attrition, the very sort of warfare it had been conceived to overcome. Vast production was matched by vast losses. The British and Americans, who produced 30,000 tanks in 1943, found they needed all that came off the factory line. The Russians manufactured 15,000, but suffered losses at a comparable rate. But this industrial war was one the Germans could not win. Though astoundingly they produced 6,000 tanks in 1943, they could barely make good their losses. Kursk had been a terrible blow for them, the first and greatest of the attrition battles. The British equivalent was Operation Goodwood, where they lost 300 tanks in 2 days. It was their great tank offensive designed to break out of Normandy in 1944, and it failed. In the Battle of Berlin, the Red Army lost 2,000 tanks and assault guns in 3 weeks fighting. The Israelis have sometimes been able to recapture the exhilarating pace of blitzkrieg in their wars against the Arabs. But increasingly they too have found that mass tank battles on narrow fronts kill crews and fill tank graveyards in the same way that the Western Front killed infantry. The tank has also proved to have its limitations. In built-up areas, in close country, in the jungle, as the Americans found in Vietnam, it is all too vulnerable to close-range weapons handled by a hidden enemy. Yet the whole experience of tank warfare, good and bad, has made the men who live in and fight from these armored monsters a breed apart from other soldiers.
The noise is terrific. It's not only the noise of the engine and of the tracks or of the gunfire outside or of your own gun. It's also the noise that's coming through your headphones, the mush, which can be absolutely piercing. It was also, of course, very closed in. It didn't do to be claustrophobic. There was total confusion. It's what Clausewitz called the fog of war. I mean, it was really very literally there in my experience.
Every battle is chaotic. When you are in a tank, especially as a driver, and you don't see very much, it is chaotic. You get new orders every few minutes, a little bit to here, a little bit to there. As an infantry soldier, there's a certain purpose in it. You see what you are doing. You can defend yourself. Having no vision of what is going on around you, that creates a chaotic condition in your mind.
When you were in action, the tank commander was either sitting on a very, very small seat or mainly standing up. If you were standing up, average chap could just about look over the edge of the cupola. And you'd be standing there for about 12, 14 hours during the day in the summer. In that time, you've got very little exercise in yourself. And we found to start with, we were getting something that was called tank commander's legs. The legs just became very swollen between the knees and the ankles. It was very, very painful. You daren't take your boots off. If you took your boots off, you'd never get them back on again.
So it's horrible. I disliked it all the time. One never admits it, really. One always tries to tell, as a young soldier, heroic stories. But the smell and the noise, in summer it's very hot. In winter it's very cold.
When the winter came on, if you were feeling a little hungry, you could shove potatoes down the exhaust pipes of the tank and let them rumble away in the silencers for a minute or two, and then you revved up the thing, you held a bucket there, you had a bucket full of beautiful roast potatoes or things like that, and against orders we were always brewing up tea on our petrol cookers inside the tank. But the big problem when we were in action for a long time, you know, perhaps 3 or 4 hours, and you were completely closed down, you couldn't get out, of course, how did you pee? And the only way to cope with this problem was that you shoved a 75mm round into the gun, you fired off the round in the direction of Germany, you got out the shell case, and you used that. But you had to be very careful because these shell cases were very hot when they came out of the breech.
The only toilet you had was your steel helmet. You use it for anything and everything, besides shaving. But you also use it for your toilet. You open up your little cubby hole, and out they went and went back on your head again.
On operations, which of course was most of the time in Normandy and Northwest Europe, we would sleep at night under a canvas bivouac beside the tank if we bothered to put that up. I mean, often we would just sort of sleep on the ground on our ground sheets, sometimes under the tank, because that offered a degree of safety, though there were people who told horrid tales of tanks having sunk into the ground and killed people.
Hey, come on.
Okay.
Let's go, Matt. Come on, Matt.
When you're in the tank, it's like a snow. You're carrying your own house around with you. Everything you want is with you. You've got to carry on the tank all your belongings that you need stacked somewhere on the tank. Your blankets, your ground sheet. We had our tank adapted to, on the front was these brackets. We had little ammunition boxes with all our personal bits and pieces in there. The odd bottle of whiskey or two when we got the chance. That was in there as well.
The other brew, Mother. Cheers. Yeah. Cheers, Doc.
All our pockets were full of coffee. We didn't bother putting in ammunition because the coffee was important in the morning. You're cold, you want a cup of coffee. The infantrymen used to love us for that. They'd bang their rifle on a tank and shove in their cup through the porthole, and we'd heat up the water for them, and they'd have hot coffee. So they used to love that, you see.
All right, tell me.
Going up with that too.
Yeah, we'll be going anyway for it.
We ate together. It was immediately possible to spot the best cook in the crew or in the troop. And we shared the same mess tins. We often passed the same mug around. We ate with the same knives and forks. All these inhibitions of peacetime went. I mean, we were as close as men could be to each other, and without any sort of sexual connotation. This was a matter really of loving people with whom you worked, and I don't think it too much of a hyperbole to say that that is what did exist in the tank crew. It was love in the best sense of the word.
The tank is, and seems likely to remain, the principal instrument of ground warfare. Its enemies may increase, but despite the risks and threats that menace the tank today, most experienced veterans of armored warfare believe in the tank's future.
My view is that the tank is going to be with us for many, many years to come, but it might change its shape. It might be a little bit different than it looks now, but the concept of a mobile platform that brings into the battlefield 3 dimensions, the protection, first, the firepower on board of this protection, with the mobility, is going to last with us for as long as the wars will continue in the land.
The real problem on the battlefield of today, as it has been all down the centuries, is how to go forward in the face of the enemy. It is not an easy thing to do. The development of weapons systems in all armies tends to favor the defense, tends to make it very difficult to go forward from where you are towards where the enemy is. That is what the tank was originally produced for, and that is what the tank is primarily required for now, is a means of getting firepower forward from one place to another in the face of very considerable fire from the enemy. Now, you're not going to be able to do that without any armor around you. You're not going to be able to do it just in a bulletproof vest. You're not going to be able to do it in a helicopter, which is very vulnerable on the battlefield. You will therefore require a form of mobility, which will get you over the ground, which must be mechanical, because if you're going to take any protection with you, that's got to be moved by mechanical means. The problem for the tank in the future will be just what sort of firepower it's got to carry with it.
Men in well-prepared positions were outfought by a magnificent battalion of some 600 parachutists. In my view, this is one of the most brilliant and courageous battalion actions which has been conducted since the end of World War II. And all of those of us in the armed forces salute to para.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain James, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Fryer, Lance Corporal Thorpe, Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman-Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meaton, Private Dixon, Lieutenant Nunn, Corporal Melia. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
War exacts a heavy price from the soldiers who take part in it. Wounds and death are the currency of battle, and this ground over which I am now walking, Tyne Cot, a First World War cemetery in Belgium, has probably seen more of this grim currency than any other spot on the face of the earth. The First World War killed 1 million soldiers from the British Empire, over 1.25 million Frenchmen, and nearly 2 million Germans. In the Second, the Germans lost 2 million on the Eastern Front, and the Russians 20 million, military and civilian. Death on this scale is difficult to grasp, but each one of these graves, and there are nearly 12,000 in this cemetery alone, represents a dead soldier. But these graves represent only the dead whose bodies were recovered. Many of those killed were never found at all. Some were blown to tatters by a direct hit, or simply lost in the mud and never found. Their names are recorded as those who have no known grave. 35,000 just in this sector in 15 months. But each man was more than a soldier, with his name, rank and number and regiment frozen into stone. He was a son, a father, an individual whose loss spread its own ripples of anguish far beyond this place. This is, and always has been, the human price of war.
It was hell, really, because I have never seen a group of people dead in one place at any time. Like I say, the first gentleman I seen, first soldier I seen was without his head. And it was horrible because his insides was coming out and he looked like the inside of a mattress.
I remember my corporal, Westphalia, tall boy. He was on my left side and he touched the wire and suddenly there was a big explosion, was a booby trap, and we didn't find him anymore. Just a few pieces of flesh, you know. And I myself, he had protected me by going on my side, and so the charge didn't hit me, but him.
When I first got to Vietnam, I was flown out by helicopter to where my battalion was, and these guys had been in a firefight the night before, and they were carrying bodies in these green rubber bags with handles on them, where they had them literally stacked to this helicopter. And I got off, and one of the guys said, "Hey, Doc, how about helping us carry some of these body bags to the helicopter?" And I said, "Okay." And I picked one up, and I looked down at the tag on the body bag, and it was the guy that I was replacing, the medic that I was replacing in Vietnam, which was a hell of a greeting, so to speak.
When people were really very badly hurt, and probably they were on the verge of dying, and though they might be married men and there might be people aged 30 or 40, their shout was always for their mother. And it didn't matter whether this was a German soldier or a British soldier or American soldier. I noticed this on several occasions, that they were shouting for Mutter or Mum. And even when I knelt beside them and tried to comfort them, their last thoughts would be with their mother rather than with their wives or any of their children.
It's difficult for people to understand the bond of love which we had between one another. In Australia, when one dies in a hospital bed, sterile, with white starched coats around, and very often the next of kin are not even there when death takes place. In our case, it was different. We were like a family because we had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to talk to, so that we became much closer than brothers. When anybody died, they died in a fantastic atmosphere of love. They died with the head in the lap of another person. It was something which was so fantastically beautiful. It was one of the great privileges of my life to be there helping somebody to die.
You were wondering why it wasn't you. It's not as if it only happened once, but it was happening all the time. When the shrapnel were bursting up above you, and they were going down like hot cakes, but you were still there. You'd look at one another. Nobody'd say anything, but everybody thought the same. I wonder how many honours will be left. You see, it's just the luck of the draw.
It went on and on and on. There was the scream of the shells coming over and the scream of the moaning of the dying men. And I felt unable to move. There was a dressing station only a short distance from me. And you see, the doctors, as you can imagine, were very hard worked. And when they got a case that they thought was hopeless, they didn't try to help him. They just put him outside. He was left to die.
There are terrible fates other than death that can befall soldiers. Many of the casualties of war live on, perhaps to recover completely, but often with permanent reminders of their sufferings, like these disabled French veterans about to watch the Bastille Day parade in Paris.
I wouldn't stay here.
At one level, this scene underscores the curious paradox of war, with maimed veterans watching fit young soldiers march past. At another level, it illustrates the care that armies now take of their wounded. Unless a soldier believes that everything possible will be done for him if he does become a casualty, his morale will suffer. In July 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg, over 7,000 men were killed, but 33,000 were wounded, and they gave the armies the daunting task of caring for them. Some were carried into makeshift hospitals in the town's churches. Boards were laid across the tops of the pews, and the wounded were crammed in like so many sardines. One nurse described how, entering the aisle, she seemed to stand waist high in a sea of anguish. The men in here were luckier than other wounded. Many lay in the woods and fields where they'd fallen. 5 days after the battle, ambulances were still bringing them in. In the Civil War, as in all earlier conflicts, disease was the greatest killer. But all the same, on the Union side, more than 250,000 soldiers received serious wounds caused by firearms. For centuries, though, wounds came from the cutting and stabbing of edged weapons. It was the fractures caused by blows from maces and falls from horses with which surgeons had to cope. Medieval military medicine was usually as barbaric as the weapons themselves. Some remedies, like pouring boiling oil into sword cuts, were agonizing and all too often caused fatal infections. Missile weapons inflicted deep, penetrating wounds that stretched the skills of the surgeons who were usually amateurs. In 1544, the English surgeon Thomas Close complained that most of his colleagues were cobblers, tinkers, and sowgelders. Gunpowder brought with it another grisly catalogue of injuries, from wounds inflicted by heavy lead musket balls to limbs mangled by round shot. Surgeons were more skilled than their ancestors. Nevertheless, their methods remained primitive, and even if the patient survived the operation, he was likely to die from infection after it. Major battles, like Waterloo, simply swamped an army's medical facilities. Even if a man was carried from the field by bandsmen or his comrades, he might lie for hours in a crowded field hospital before an exhausted surgeon could operate on him, on a table already slippery with the blood of others. One of the main problems in treating the wounded was the time it took to get them off the battlefield. Some would have perished in any case, but many a wounded man's life seeped away as he lay out for days and nights, waiting for help which was too long in coming. Some clear-sighted medical officers began to recognize that their most important task was to ensure that the wounded were carried promptly and properly away from the conflict, but they lacked the means to do it. It was a French doctor, Baron Dominique Larry, who came up with a solution. He designed a light ambulance wagon, sprung to ease the discomfort of the journey. He also organized field ambulances with two distinct parts: wagons which brought the wounded in, and a field hospital where they were treated. Amputation was the stock in trade of surgeons of the era. It was rapid and radical. Larry himself amputated 200 limbs during the Battle of Borodino in 1812. In 1846, an American doctor carried out the first operation under a general anesthetic, and soon chloroform was widely used. The plight of the men wounded at Gettysburg was, in a marked sense, easier than that of the Waterloo casualties 30 years earlier. They were anesthetized before surgery. By World War I, weapons had become even more destructive, and their impact on the human body correspondingly more horrible. Millions of men were wounded, maimed, and mutilated. But medical science, too, had improved the treatment of the wounded. Soldiers were now immunized against most of the diseases that had once killed them in their thousands. There was now also a properly organized chain of medical evacuation that got them off the battlefield to effective treatment with unprecedented speed. A wounded man could go from his own regimental aid post to an advanced dressing station, thence to a casualty clearing station, and on to hospital. A wounded British soldier might find himself in Blighty, slang for England, within a day of being hit. Back in England, newly pioneered antiseptics and even large-scale blood transfusions increased enormously the chances of survival. Leslie Walkington went through a typical experience.
At last the signal came and we started off. And, well, you say charge, well, it was more of us scrambled over very uneven ground, and we fell over and picked ourselves up. Eventually we got to the German second line, and they put a barrage on that. One of the first shells of the barrage fell near me, and it hit me in the bottom. It was just like being kicked by an enormous elephant. It hit me in the bottom and lifted me right up in the air, and I collapsed onto the ground, and my sergeant jumped down beside me and said, "I better stay with you, sir." And I said, "You know perfectly well you mustn't stay with me. If I gave you a talk only yesterday that if you stop and help your wounded as you go along, you double the casualties.
So you carry on, take the men on. And all right, so good luck, and off he went. But then I lay there feeling pretty helpless. I did crawl into a shell hole, and this barrage, the shells were just blasting away all round me. There were people shouting, in pain and whatnot all round. Eventually, I had recovered enough to be able to crawl. And so I crawled back to our front line. And I was then carried on stretcher right into Ypres and eventually into a bliss of an ambulance train with real nurses, with lovely, clean linen pinafores. It was bliss. I'd got what we call a blighty one, meaning, I was bound to be sent home to England.
In Walkington's case, his blighty wound got him to England, but didn't end his war. He was comfortably looking after cavalry horses when a friend from his own division happened to meet him.
He said, I heard your voice and I knew it at once. What the hell are you doing here? Why don't you come out again? I was sort of stimulated. I thought, well, if he wants me. And I said, well, I will come out if you like. I went to see my commanding officer in England. What do you want? I said, please, sir, I want to be sent back to France. And I then burst into tears. But I went. And I rejoined my old friend, and we spent Armistice Day together.
Of all the new weapons which taxed the skills of doctors, gas, the devil's breath, was the most feared. The sight of its victims shook even the sternest resolve.
Oh, it killed thousands. And when you'd seen the others, you thought, Christ, I hope it don't serve me like them. To see 1,000, you march by 1,000, that's a mile, easy. And those that could walk, to see the state they were in, they'd rather got shot through the heart straight away than try and get over it, because it was horrible. When the gas came, as we were running into it, one suggested tying a wet handkerchief over your nose and mouth. And then our same officer, Topper Brown, he says that'd be no good at all. He says it's chlorine gas, the yellow stuff, as was like. The antidote to chlorine was sal ammoniac, he says. We can't get the sal ammoniac. The nearest we can get to it is your piss. And that's what we had to do. We tore our shirts. And as one got dry, you took it off, stopped breathing, and nobody else would do it for you because they wanted their own, you see, if you asked for a mother. We had to keep drinking anything you could because you'd got to keep peeing. But we were very lucky with this here stuff tied on us.
Well, it was uncomfortable. You couldn't touch your face. In fact, you couldn't eat. When I arrived at the hospital, I was placed in this gas ward. And you knew you were in a gas ward immediately because of the saline solution, which was very apparent, and blisters on some of them were terrible. The worst thing about this, and when you get to pain, was one day a nurse came in and she says, about time you shaved. She gave me a razor, a little cold water, and I shaved. And I've had a tender face ever since to remember her by.
War can damage the mind as well as the body. During the First World War, thousands of soldiers suffered from what in those days was called shell shock. Some men were unhinged by sudden terror. Some fought until their will crumbled, and some were too frail to stand the stress. Doctors have abandoned the term shell shock and now talk of battle shock and combat exhaustion. In the armies of the Second World War, there was often one psychiatric casualty to every 2 or 3 physical ones. Many had simply seen too much fighting and were utterly worn out. The treatment of psychiatric casualties has gradually improved. They are now likely to be rested, rehabilitated, and returned to their units within days. Not all are so lucky. For some, the mental scars of battle never heal. For the soldiers who fight in tanks, fire is the main enemy.
As I came out of the tank, any part of my skin, my hand, which this was burnt, all this was burnt. And as I touched it, my skin stood there. The tank was so hot, and as I moved, my skin stood there, and it took the skin right off. My face was burnt from rolling off the tank. The tank was a red-hot skillet. And as I rolled off, that's exactly what happened. I remember they had me greased from head to foot with Vaseline and stuff. And in here, in this ward, they put a machine and they start peeling skin off me. Just all over, just peeling skin. And it was torture 24 hours a day because there was no relief for pain. I mean, they give you shots, but I mean, a burner, you put your finger in a fire or touch yourself with a cigarette. Imagine most of your body being burned. It was horrible. You never had any moment that you didn't feel pain. Believe me.
They were running up the side of a hill, and the leading tank being there, I managed to run over some telemines. And these mines went off, one under one track and one under the other track, which made a terrific bang, obviously, and my steel helmet was blown off. My berry was blown off. The headphones were ripped off. The skin on my face came down and was hanging around my chin like a beard. My hair went an off shade of brown as you put your hand in it, so it fell off, all singed. My hands and arms, they were burnt as well.
By the Second World War, the task of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield was largely solved.
I had a brain gun, which wasn't the best of weapons to carry around on patrol. I opened up, or I didn't, in fact, because the magazine has obviously got muck in it, and it just didn't fire at all. And one of the Germans shot me with a Schmeiser, which is an automatic pistol weapon, sort of a bit like the Stenger, and shot me through the legs. And then the two patrols, or what was left of them, started herring back, each to his own positions. And I thought I was going to be left there. But a friend of mine, called Gordon Rennie, a corporal, grabbed hold of the officer, who he was herring back, right, and said, "Come on, pick him up." And so the two of them got me out. And I was very, very fortunate indeed. We got me back to the battalion headquarters where the MO saw me, and the orderly gave me an injection of morphine, and then an ambulance came after a while. They obviously radioed for us, and took me back to what we call Casualty Clearance Centre, practically on the beaches, waiting, I suppose, for the sort of tank landing craft, American tank landing craft, which would get rid of its tanks, and then it was fitted out as a hospital ship. It was very economical.
Air power transformed casualty evacuation. By 1944, air evacuation was the norm in the British and American armies, and the wounded could be whisked back from forward airstrips to hospitals in the rear, saving time and lives. By the time of Vietnam, the Americans had revolutionized the evacuation of their wounded.
Can you get him back here? Okay, can you get him back here, though? Remember to stop the bleeding. Stand stop.
We spotted a gook. Oh.
Wait, 4-3 is blue.
Oh, man.
Wait one, we'll get this man out first.
Yeah.
The dust-off helicopter snatched thousands of wounded soldiers from the very teeth of a firefight, saving men with appalling injuries.
It sure wasn't a pretty sight. I realized immediately that I was missing both of my legs, and I initially didn't realize I had lost my left hand. But I kept looking down, and I'll never forget the femur bone in my left leg had shattered in half. And what was left, what was connected to me, was sticking up in the air, and I remember reaching down and grabbing a hold of that. When he got to me, I just initially looked at him and I said, "Gomer, just let me alone, let me die. I can see what's wrong with me. I don't want to live." He leaned down, slapped me across the face, told me that I had family back home and I had a lot to live for. And at that point, come the realization that I could make it. After Gomer got to me, then our medic came to me, and he was preparing himself to give me a shot of morphine, which he ultimately did, but it was kind of funny. He got to my one side, in which my good arm was, and I can still see this individual, Doc Hayes. He was trying to give me a shot of morphine, and he was really nervous, and I remember looking over at him, and I looked at the needle, and he was getting ready, had the shot in his hand, the needle and all. The needle was moving like a sewing machine, running wild, and I told him, for goodness sakes, don't cut off my other arm. And I remember reaching over, and I actually had to hold on to his arm to help calm him down so he could give me a shot to help eliminate the pain.
Soldiers on patrol knew that if they were wounded, a helicopter would bring them to the operating table within an hour of being hit. Such prompt medical attention meant only 1% of the wounded died after reaching hospital.
I took a bullet in the thigh. It felt like someone had stabbed me with a hot poker, that someone had taken something red hot. There was an incredible burning sensation. And I remember my leg, it just knocked my leg right out from under me. I thought, if I can still stand up, I'm going to stand up. And I could still stand up. I had broken all 3 bones in my leg, but they were undisplaced fractures. The second round broke the bone again, and that time I would not have been able to stand. I was a bloody mess. And I remember feeling that my leg was now going to be cut off. The pain was incredible. It hurt like nothing has ever hurt before. I remember they gave me a lot of morphine and a lot of drugs, and basically the pain went away. I remember waking up in a hospital, and the doctor is talking to me. I haven't heard everything he said. I haven't heard anything he said, but I sort of become conscious at the point that he says, "And that's why I have to send you back to the States." I heard nothing else. That's the word. Those are the words I wanted to hear.
In the Falklands, the frontline soldiers were expected to look after their own wounded on the battlefield before casualties were transported to the field hospital at Ajax Bay.
The men accepted that if they fell, they would have to look after themselves until the objective was taken, it was fought through, secured, and then their friends would come back for them. So the initial emphasis was on self-aid. Every man was equipped with a first field dressing and morphine, and some idea about what to do.
Shut us up. Right into there, right? We should go home. Eh? What is it? Sold. It's sold.
77 men died during the land battle from a combination of gunshot, blast, and shrapnel injury. Most of them died outright or within the first 5 to 10 minutes. Everybody who got back to Ajax Bay alive or to one of the forward surgical complexes survived, and all the way back to Uganda, where only 3 men subsequently died of their injuries.
Death or wounds may be the most immediate danger a soldier faces in battle. But there's also the risk of capture by the enemy. Now, for centuries, to be taken prisoner was the greatest hardship a soldier could undergo. The right of his captor to kill him or rob him or sell him for ransom was undisputed, and his survival was largely a matter of chance. Even by the 19th century, there was little improvement. And then, sickened by the sight of casualties at the Battle of Solferino in 1859, the Swiss businessman Henri Dunant swore to change the habits of nations. What shocked Dunant was that many of the wounded still lay out for days, as they always had, and even the fortunate ones were cared for in ramshackle field hospitals whose doctors were overwhelmed by the scale of their task. His campaign brought about the first Geneva Convention and the subsequent founding of the Red Cross, an organization of non-combatants who treated the wounded of either side without distinction. This is the original Geneva Convention of 1864. Further agreements on the treatment of all prisoners, whether wounded or not, led to the Hague Convention of 1907 and finally to the famous Geneva Convention of 1929. Frequently abused, criticized, or ignored, the Geneva Convention and the International Red Cross together have nevertheless brought a level of humanity to warfare this century of which our ancestors could not have dreamed.
Of course, with the Geneva Convention, we had to treat the enemy just the same as our own men. They were injured, they were human, and as far as we were concerned, God's creatures, and a life was a life, whether it be German or whatever nationality. We had to transfuse them, and we had to give them precious drugs and everything just the same as our own men. There was no distinction whatsoever as far as we were concerned. Being trained, you did realize that a patient is a patient and always will be. And that, I think, has got to come first. If you once get away from that aspect of the thing, I don't think you would be much good to humanity.
And that attitude was tested when a Skyhawk pilot who was shot down attacking one of our ships and broke his knee as he ejected safely was brought in, and we mended his knee. And our greatest anxiety was that Teniente Primero Ricardo Lechero's wife and child back in Cordoba should hear as soon as possible that he had survived. That was our major concern. And that man is now back in the cockpit of a Skyhawk. I wish him well, and I know he was grateful for the way we looked after him.
But the bitterness of some conflicts results in the Geneva Convention being ignored.
One time I treated the enemy, which is kind of a tragic story because it taught me a lot about the dehumanizing that takes place in that kind of a setting. I was there about 2 weeks, and an enemy soldier had been shot in the jaw, basically, after we had been battling with them. And being bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I went to do a tracheotomy, which would make it easier for him to breathe and probably survive. My senior medic at that point in time walked up as I was doing the tracheotomy and said, "Let me finish it for you." I looked at him and said, "Well, I'm almost done." And he said, "I'll finish it for you." And he pulled out a large hunting knife and slit the guy's throat from ear to ear. And I looked at him and I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "You'll know why when you're here 13 months. And he walked off. The sad part about it was I understood it 6 months later. I didn't condone it, but I understood it.
There are also two sides to the treatment of unwounded prisoners. Sometimes, where captor and prisoners are not widely separated by race, culture, or ideology, they relate as one soldier to another, conscious of having shared a common peril. There are flashes of comradeship and even of humor. These First World War Germans are being deprived of their trouser buttons to stop them escaping. It's difficult to run away if you're holding up your trousers. During the Second World War, in fighting between the Germans and the Western Allies, there were occasional lapses when prisoners were not taken at all or were mistreated after capture. Generally, though, prisoners were treated firmly but fairly. The very act of searching an enemy soldier, turning out his cigarettes, photographs, and paybook, somehow confirmed that he was a man like any other. who happened to be wearing a different uniform. The Germans treated their enemy altogether differently on the Eastern Front. Russian prisoners, taken in their hundreds of thousands in 1941 and 42, were herded off to Germany to work as slave labor. Over half these men perished from overwork, brutality, hunger, or simple neglect. The Germans regarded the Russians, whether soldier or civilian, as Untermenschen, a lower form of life, not entitled to ordinary human consideration.
They knew we were on the retreat and we were moving out of it, and they did quite a few things which they would not have dared when we were advancing. When we were advancing, they knew if they would have killed one German soldier, we would have flattened the whole village. Quite a few soldiers got killed on the retreat, and we just didn't have the time to do our atrocities as we otherwise would have done and as we would have liked to do, and I say it with shame.
The atrocities committed by Germans in occupied areas brought their inevitable retribution. The tables were turned. Almost half the Germans captured on the Eastern Front never returned home. Some toiled on in prison camps until 1955. Allied prisoners in Japanese hands fared no better. Japan's martial code of Bushido stressed that no soldier should permit himself to be captured, so they despised all prisoners. On the infamous Death Railway in Thailand, prisoners worked long hours in a crippling climate, a prey to tropical diseases and the sadism of some of their guards. During the Vietnam War, most of the prisoners taken by the North Vietnamese were American aircrew, shot down on missions over the north. Their ordeal began with the humiliation of a public parade before a hostile population. Then came even harsher treatment, as the North Vietnamese sought to impose a different ideology on their captured enemy.
Once you are captured, their objective is then to break your complete will. I think that history has taught that people still have a resistance, and we did. We resisted as a group, as individuals. We resisted their efforts to, what I say, indoctrinate me, to teach me, because they said, you must learn the truth. You must learn the truth. You will never return until you have changed your attitude and learned the truth.
In the earlier conflict of the Korean War in 1950, communist ideology had already confronted Western beliefs. Here, too, the soldiers of North Korea and Communist China rarely observed the standards of the Geneva Convention in the treatment of their prisoners of war.
When I was taken into this room by some political officers of the North Korean army in the political prison in Pyongyang, it was immediately apparent, without anybody saying anything to me, it was a torture chamber. It was windowless. It had sort of sinister-looking objects lying around and hanging on hooks on the wall, and I knew in my bones that that's what it was. They'd brought me in there. The circumstances of my being taken in, of course, I suppose enhanced that. I wouldn't give the information required, and a chap called the young major, we called him, he just said, all right, he said, all right, you'll see. You're bound in a chair, your hands behind your back, the chair's then thrown in its back, you're naked to the waist, they pour water over you, then they put a towel over your face and neck, and then they begin to pour water onto the towel. Now what happens is, the first water pulls down the towel a bit to your face, then as you go on, you get less and less air and more water coming in, and it's an effective, slow way of drowning, and you begin to drown. Now, they, of course, have done this a number of times before, and they knew the moment you went out that that's the time they've got to get you on your feet again, as it were, to drain some water out of you. So as you'd gone out, then one would find that the chair had been tipped back up again, and you were streaming water out, and they were banging you, and the young major used to stub out his lighted cigarette in my back for good measure. It took me a long time to get rid of those scars. And then most times one was either left like that for some time and they did it again, or you were once if you looked pretty groggy and then they'd bring you back later on.
But you reach a point where you have to decide for yourself that you reach that limit, and everyone has his own limits. That when you reach that point, that if you go beyond, you know, you're not only physically hurt, maybe. I mean, some fellows never came back from these sessions. But then, if they break you, then your resistance, your ability to resist in the future, we knew would be broken. So we would reach that point where we give them as little as we could to get by. They let us go, but ready to come back as next time. And we knew there would be a next time, and they did come back.
They began almost every time by beating me up. That used to make me very indignant. Even though being beaten up was painful, indignation was certainly as powerful as fear in my mind, and feeling of pain and shock. When I was bound in a chair and they gave me the water treatment, then really I became almost numb with fear. And in order not to give in, I had to play a sort of game with myself. I thought, well, I'll do this once more. I can just carry through this once more, then I'm going to give in. And so I promised myself that each time I'd do it once more. If I hadn't done that, I think I would have collapsed.
I always felt, boy, this can't last first more than a week or two, and my government will come and get me, take me out. Then it became, well, maybe a month, and then it became a game with us. We would then say, well, it looks like we'll be home for, if it was Christmas, we'll be home for Easter. And if it was Easter, well, 4th of July. 4th of July, home by Thanksgiving was a motto. And then as we got into September, October, well, maybe New Year's and Christmas. Christmas or New Year's, but never more than 6 months away. You had to maintain that frame of mind. You had to keep your optimism up. Had I known I was going to be 8.5 years, boy, I don't know what I would have done.
You were told you were going to be shot.
I was very relieved at that, because I dreaded going back into the torture chamber. And I thought it was a good soldierly way to die. I'd be quick. The wry thought crossed my mind as I went out with this file of riflemen and the captain who'd been one of my torturers. I thought, I hope they will inform my government so my wife can get my pension. And off we went. And I was quite prepared on this lovely autumn day. Blue sky, white rolling clouds, a lot of sun, quite warm for North Korea. I was quite prepared to be tied to a stake or have a pistol put behind my ear and be shot. It had no great horrors for me as an alternative to going back to the torture ground.
I think the hardest period was when they called me in at Christmas. And the interrogator, the camp commander, said, Alvarez, a letter from your mother, and your wife has left you and married another man. You know, for years I hung on to that. And that was, I read the letter, and it was really crushing.
Conventions and medicine may sometimes soften the harsher aspects of war. But nothing can ultimately conceal its essential inhumanity or the brutal effect of modern weapons. These Iranians are experiencing the dreadful symptoms of chemical warfare, even though it was outlawed by another Geneva Convention 60 years ago. If these are the results of so-called conventional war, what horrors will follow the impact of a nuclear bomb? The dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima killed or wounded 320,000 men, women and children. 40 years on, people are still dying from its effects. In total war, it is not just soldiers who face the risks of battle. Today's armies train to survive even the unimaginable impact of tomorrow's weapons. They play out a scenario that dares to contemplate the aftermath of a nuclear battlefield. Yet even the miracles of modern medicine must falter in the face of so impossible a task. Perhaps the prospect of casualties and suffering on a scale that dwarfs even the destruction of the two world wars may begin to achieve what none of the Geneva Conventions have ever attempted, the outlawing of war itself.